This meeting is being recorded.
This is our group project for Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, a prominent British writer of the 19th century, would tour the United States a few times both before and after the American Civil War. Dickens' famous novels were all about the human struggle. He would delve into the dismal lives of the British orphan, the plight of those in the workhouse and the poorhouse. He would write about the prisoner and the dark alleys of London where unfathomable deeds would be witnessed. Dickens had seen the worst scenarios that the uncharitable British lack of welfare could show. When he visited in 1842, he had anticipated leaving these scenes behind. He was welcomed and entertained by the best hosts that the United States had to offer. He was wined and dined and shown the epitome of the American high life. He was not prepared for visiting a tobacco plantation that was worked by slaves. The worst he had seen and written about in England held no candle to what he witnessed in Virginia.
So the first couple of questions we asked were about Charles Dickens' understanding of the Civil War. The first being, how did Charles Dickens come to understand the Civil War? And the second question being, how did Charles Dickens use the Civil War and his understanding for his agenda? So Dickens' understanding of the war and the United States as a whole. So in 1842, Dickens went to the United States, went through both the North and South, where he kept notes of it, which would come to be known as the writings of the American Notes. During this time, he acquired a lot of criticisms of the United States. These opinions he would gather then and throughout leading up to the Civil War would change his opinion on both the country and the Civil War as a whole. Dickens had believed the United States, and in particular the North, were full of greed and poor morals, and it was more about economic success than anything else. And Dickens had questioned the abolitionist fervor of the Union, eventually ending up supporting the South, believing that the Union were using a mask of abolitionism for economic gain. And the second question would be, how did this understanding of the United States and the Civil War affect Dickens' agenda? So as previously mentioned, he had several passages prior to the war that criticized the United States. And he only had one published writing during the time of the issue, The Young Man from the Country, which focused more on the political landscape of the United States, as he kept more of his stronger opinions to himself. These opinions were likely kept to himself to not affect the sales of his books. Many soldiers would read his works while at war. After the war, Dickens did come back to the United States, which he photographed the battlefields. He then ended up showing these photos to Queen Victoria herself, which is really, aside from book sales, the only way he kind of gained any sort of prominence from Civil War and his criticisms of the country, which was prominence with Queen Victoria, but it had occurred after the war.
So Charles Dickens and his views of the American Civil War, we asked a couple of questions. So the first was, how did his opinions compare to that of Americans who lived at the time? And then the other question was, how did his opinions change over time? So before the war, Charles Dickens, he had no support for the United States in general. So he held major criticisms of the nation that he kept to himself for the most part. However, he did create several anti-American articles in his magazine all the year round. These were not direct criticisms of the U.S., but more so short stories alluding to the negative qualities of the U.S. at the time. He also, as mentioned before, wrote The Young Man from the Country, in which he directly criticized shady and corrupt politics, corrupt newspapers, backstabbing, and lobbying in the U.S. democratic system. Prior to 1861, Charles Dickens had more criticisms of the South and the North, mainly because of King Cotton and its impacts in the European specter, and then also his criticisms of slavery, which aligned to many Europeans living at the time. During the American Civil War, many Americans had different opinions on which side was right. So German American immigrants were more concerned with the abolition outright of slavery, following Carl Schurz in wanting to protect the rights of all human beings, whereas Irish American immigrants were more concerned with maintaining their status as citizens, believing that if slavery was abolished, they would be reduced in their status in the U.S. They even rioted against Union drafts during the Civil War, following the works of John Mitchell. So Charles Dickens, his opinions was different from the two, believing that neither side had good views, and he aligned himself more with moderates in the U.S. Until he read The American Unions by James Spence and James Mason. He had a change of heart where he was convinced that slavery had nothing to do with the start of the war. He wrote that the North was suppressing the South and only started supporting Black people when it became convenient for them. He wrote several personal letters, not outright, or he wrote several personal letters criticizing the North and supporting the South. However, these were never made public, so they were just written personal, where he considered himself to be a Southern sympathizer.
In conclusion, although Dickens had not liked what he had seen on his visit to the United States in 1842, he would change his opinions of the North as well. He was not a supporter of the United States and did not respect it as a nation, but would come to have a firmer understanding of what the South's cause was than that of the North, because the South's agenda was more honest, and he felt the North was hiding behind the morality of slavery to gain the upper hand. Dickens would keep most of his harsher opinions of the nation to himself, possibly from fear of what it would do to his future book sales.